The lobby of Harrington Capital was designed to be seen through, floor-to-ceiling glass on three sides, white marble that reflected the overhead lights in long, cold streaks. The building had been written up in 3 architecture magazines the year it opened, praised for its transparency, a metaphor, the profile said, for the company's values. Carolyn Harrington had read those profiles and said nothing. She understood that transparency was something companies performed, not practiced. It was 6:43 in the morning when she arrived, earlier than anyone expected. That was the point. She wore a charcoal blazer, her dark hair pulled into a knot at the base of her skull, and she moved through the lobby the way she moved through most things, without hesitation, without softness, without the small concessions of eye contact that most people offered each other as a matter of courtesy. The security guard at the front desk straightened. A junior associate near the elevator pretended to check his phone. She noticed both. What she also noticed, because she noticed everything that happened in this building, was the man on his knees near the east corridor. He was perhaps 60. Gray at the temples, a little heavy in the shoulders, wearing the pale blue uniform that the contracted cleaning staff wore. He was running a mop along the baseboard at the edge of what everyone in the building understood without any signage, purely by proximity to the private elevator bank, to be the executive corridor. The VIP zone, a corridor that was not cleaned until after 8 o'clock, after the executive assistants had arrived, so that the cleaning staff would never be present when senior leadership walked through. She stopped. He didn't look up. He moved the mop in slow, deliberate strokes, the way a person moves when they've done something 10,000 times and no longer need to think about it. "Excuse me." Her voice in the empty lobby was very clear. The security guard went still. The man looked up. His face was calm. Not the careful blankness of someone who was afraid, but the settled calm of someone who had made peace with being invisible in rooms like this. He had a broad face, a jaw that had once been strong and was still recognizable as such. Gray eyes. He looked at her without apology or performance. "This area," she said, "is not part of your assigned section." He said nothing. "The east corridor is off limits to cleaning staff before 8. "I know," he said. His voice was even. "There was a spill last night. Someone tracked it from the entrance. I didn't want it to dry into the stone." She looked at the floor. It was clean. It had clearly been cleaned already. He was, she realized, not cleaning. He was checking. Running the mop to make sure nothing had been missed. "You're not authorized to be in this section." "No." He agreed. She turned to the security desk. "Call HR." The guard picked up the phone. The man with the mop didn't argue. He stood slowly, like someone whose knees had grown accustomed to protest, and he looked at her with the same undisturbed expression. He didn't plead. He didn't explain. He just stood there, mop in hand, in the marble corridor, and waited. "You can leave your equipment," she said. "Someone will come for it." He set the mop against the wall with a care that bordered on ceremony. Then he walked without hurrying, without dragging his feet toward the service exit. By the time the HR director, a nervous woman named Patricia Aldridge, arrived 20 minutes later, there was paperwork to sign. Carolyn Harrington had already moved on to her 7 o'clock briefing. She hadn't asked the man's name. The young analyst who'd been standing near the elevator that morning was named Ethan Marsh. He was 26, in his second year at Harrington Capital. And he had grown reasonably good at not letting things bother him. The hours were long. The culture was cold. The work itself, financial modeling, competitive analysis, the endless construction of arguments for why one company was worth more than another, he found genuinely interesting, and he had learned to separate the work from the environment the way you might eat a good meal in an unpleasant restaurant. But he could not stop thinking about the man with the mop. He mentioned it to his colleague, Diane Purcell, at lunch, in the small way people mention things that bother them when they're not sure they have the right to be bothered. "The janitor this morning," he said. She fired him. Diane looked at her salad. "I heard. He was just cleaning. He was in the wrong section. He was cleaning a spill." Diane said nothing for a moment. Then, "Don't make it a thing, Ethan." He didn't make it a thing. But he didn't stop thinking about it either. Patricia Aldridge processed the termination at 9:15. The file was thinner than most. Name, Walter Gaines. Age, 58. Employment start date. 4 years ago. Contracted through a facilities management company called Meridian Services. Emergency contact. None listed. Previous employment. Blank. She frowned at the blank. HR forms required previous employment. People left that line empty, sometimes by accident, sometimes by choice. She sent a query to Meridian Services asking for a fuller file. They responded that afternoon with a 2-sentence email. Mr. Gaines provided satisfactory service throughout his contract. His personnel file was processed at intake and is not available for redistribution. She thought about following up. She didn't. She had 14 other open items on her desk. What she did notice, when she went down to collect the man's cleaning equipment from the east corridor, was the object on the floor beside the mop, a small notebook, the kind with a brown cardboard cover, the pages faintly yellowed at the edges. It had been set down with the same deliberateness as the mop, not dropped, placed. She picked it up. It was densely written in a small, angular hand, not the hurried scrawl of someone making to-do lists, but the careful script of someone accustomed to writing things down as a form of discipline. She didn't read it. She put it in the lost and found bin at the security desk and went back to her office. Ethan Marsh found it there at noon when he went looking for an umbrella he'd left 2 weeks earlier. He recognized the cleaning staff's handwriting style from a thank you note he'd once seen posted in the break room, a note from the overnight crew thanking the kitchen staff for leaving them coffee. He'd found the note touching. He'd thought about it for days. He took the notebook. He told himself he would return it to the man if he could find him. He put it in his bag and did not open it. Not yet. Carolyn Harrington's afternoon was a sequence of meetings that required her full attention and received it. The quarterly earnings call. A presentation from the M&A team on a potential acquisition in the Southeast. A 30-minute conversation with the company's general counsel, Theodore Morrow, about a regulatory question she'd flagged the previous week. She ate at her desk. She drank 2 cups of coffee and a glass of water. She did not think about the man with the mop. At 4:45, her assistant knocked. "Miss Harrington, there's someone here from your father's estate." She looked up. "My father's estate has a scheduled meeting next month." "Yes." He said it couldn't wait. The man who came in was named Douglas Fenn. He was in his mid-60s, silver-haired, and wore the specific expression of someone who had practiced delivering difficult news and had grown neither comfortable nor careless with it. He carried a leather portfolio. He sat across from her and placed the portfolio on her desk and did not open it immediately. "Your father's estate was settled 18 months ago," she said, "or I was told it was." "The primary estate was settled," Douglas said. "But there was a codicil, a supplemental provision to the original will, signed 14 months before your father died. He asked that it not be disclosed until he paused. He was specific about the timing. He wanted it disclosed after the company's 5th year of independent operation, which is now. She said nothing. "The codicil," Douglas said, "designates a secondary trustee, not for financial assets." For he used the phrase custodian of record. The language is unusual. It refers to documentation, specific records pertaining to the company's founding period. What records? He doesn't say in the will itself. He says the trustee will know. She felt something cold settle across her shoulders. "And the trustee's name?" Douglas opened the portfolio and turned it to face her. She looked at the name typed on the codicil. Then she looked at it again. Walter Gaines. The lobby came back to her in one image. A man in a pale blue uniform, mop in hand, looking at her without apology or performance. Her own voice. "You can leave your equipment." She sat very still. "When was this man designated?" she said. "Approximately 17 years ago. And no one in the estate process thought to. Your father was explicit that the codicil should not be included in the standard disclosure. It was held in a separate document file, accessible only after the trigger date." Douglas looked at her with the careful expression of a man who was doing his job and wanted credit for nothing beyond that. "I'm sorry, Miss Harrington. I understand this is unexpected." It was, she would later think, the greatest understatement she had encountered in her professional life. She kept the meeting with her board scheduled for the following morning. She arrived on time. She said nothing about what she'd learned the previous evening. The board meeting concerned the same regulatory matter she'd discussed with Theodore Morrow. It was resolved by 10:30. She thanked her directors and waited for the room to clear. Theodore stayed. He was 54, lean, with the careful eyes of a man who had spent 3 decades reading documents for what they didn't say. He'd been with the company since before she took over. He'd been with it since before her father stepped back. "There's something I need to look into," she said. "A personnel matter." "Huh?" "No." She slid the copy of the codicil across the table. He read it once, then read it again. When he looked up, his expression had not changed, which told her everything. "You knew him," she said. "I knew of him." "Tell me." Theodore set the document on the table. He looked at his hands for a moment, then at the window that faced east, toward the trading floor, 3 floors below. "Walter Gaines was an engineer," he said. "Not an engineer in the broad sense. He was the principal systems architect for the data infrastructure your father built in the first years of the company, before we outsourced to third-party platforms. Before any of the current technology stack existed." He paused. "He was among the first 5 employees. His name isn't in any founding documents." "No." "Why not?" Theodore was quiet for 3 full seconds. "Because something happened. Approximately 15 years ago, there was a restructuring of certain records. A decision was made at the board level to consolidate some of the early architecture documentation. In that consolidation, some attributions were removed." He met her eyes. "I don't believe it was done maliciously. I believe it was done carelessly, by people who didn't understand what they were removing, or by people who did understand." He didn't deny it. "Who was on the board at that time?" "Several people who are no longer with the company." "And one who is." She already knew the name. It settled in her chest like a stone. "Leonard Burke." Leonard Burke was 61. He had been on the board for 20 years. He sat 3 chairs to her left at every board meeting. He had a photograph of himself with her father on his office wall. He had delivered the eulogy at her father's funeral. "Is it possible," she said carefully, "that the documentation that was removed contained evidence of something that Mr. Burke would not want found?" Theodore looked at her for a long moment. "I think that's a very precise question," he said. "I think it requires a very precise answer." He nodded slowly. "Yes. It's possible." She stood. "Find Walter Gaines." He was not easy to find, and the difficulty was itself a kind of information. The address on his Meridian Services file was an apartment on the east side of the city, a neighborhood that had once been working class and had been incrementally renovated into something that called itself urban residential, without fully committing to what that meant. The building was 7 stories, brick, with a buzzer system that had been installed sometime in the 90s and never updated. She went herself. She brought no one. This was a choice she made quickly, and without fully examining her reasons, she understood only that this particular errand required no witnesses. The building manager, a heavy-set man named Frank, who smelled of cigarettes and spoke with the careful indifference of someone who had answered too many questions from too many people, told her that Walter Gaines had vacated his apartment 2 days ago, paid his last month clean, left a box of books for the building's informal library, left no forwarding address. She stood on the sidewalk outside the building and thought. She drove to a diner 6 blocks away. She'd found the address in the Meridian Services file under regular service area, an indication that the cleaning crew often worked nearby and used the diner for meals. The woman behind the counter was perhaps 55, broad-shouldered, with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the manner of someone who had worked breakfast shifts for many years and had grown fond of regulars the way other people grew fond of stray cats. Her name, from the tag on her apron, was Ruthann. "Walter Gaines," Carolyn said. She debated how to ask this. She decided that directness was less suspicious than indirection. "He used to come in here." "Do you know him?" Ruthann looked at her for a moment that stretched past comfortable. "You from the company?" "What company?" "Whatever company he cleaned for." "No," she said. And this was technically true in the way that many true things fail to be honest. "I'm trying to return something to him. He left it behind." Ruth Ann seemed to weigh this. Walter comes in Tuesdays and Thursdays usually. Eggs over easy, whole wheat. Coffee. No sugar. A pause. He didn't come in Tuesday. Did he say anything to you the last time you saw him? About leaving? He's not the kind of man who says things like that. She picked up a coffee pot and refilled a cup 2 stools down. But he left a 20 under his saucer. He always leaves a 5. She set the pot down, so I figured he was going somewhere. Carolyn left her card on the counter. Ruth Ann did not pick it up while she was watching. On the way back to her car, she passed a small apartment building with a hand-painted sign in the window advertising English tutoring. Below the sign, in a child's careful handwriting, was a paper flower, the kind children make in elementary school from construction paper, the petals cut with safety scissors. She stopped. She had no reason to stop. She looked at the paper flower for several seconds, and then continued walking. But she remembered it. She returned to that block the next morning, before 7, in different clothes jeans, a coat that did not broadcast what she spent on clothes. She walked the street slowly. A woman was hosing down the sidewalk outside a dry cleaner. 2 men were unloading boxes from a van. The city was moving in its ordinary morning rhythm, indifferent to the fact that she was in it. The hand-painted tutoring sign was still in the window. The paper flower was still there. She rang the buzzer. A girl answered the door. She was perhaps 10, with dark braids and paint on her wrist blue, the specific blue of watercolor sets, and she looked at Carolyn with the frank appraisal of a child who had not yet learned to pretend otherwise. "Is your parent home?" Carolyn asked. "My mom's on a call." "That's all right. I don't need to come in." She thought about how to ask what she wanted to ask. "Do you know a man named Walter?" "He's older. Gray hair. He may have come by here sometimes." The girl's expression changed not into wariness, but into something more specific. Something that looked like recognition. "Mr. Walter?" "Yes. He fixed our radiator." She said it the way children state significant facts without preamble. "Last winter, when it stopped working. My mom didn't know who to call, and it was really cold. He was in the building for something, and he just fixed it." She paused. "He showed me how it worked. The valve. He said everything that breaks has a reason. And if you find the reason, you can usually fix it without buying new parts." Carolyn looked at the paper flower in the window. "Did he give you that?" she said. The girl shook her head. "I made it. But I gave him one. He kept it." She said this with great satisfaction. The satisfaction of someone who has given a gift and knows it was received well. He kept it in his shirt pocket. Carolyn stood on the stoop and felt something she was not entirely prepared for. She made a note of the building's address. She would send something she was already calculating what. A practical thing, something the family needed, not a grand gesture. She would figure it out. "Thank you," she said. The girl nodded, decisive. "He's a good person," she said. "In case you're looking for him because he did something." "He didn't. I know," Carolyn said. "That's why I'm looking for him." The girl seemed satisfied with this. She stepped back inside and closed the door, and Carolyn walked back to her car through the ordinary morning street. And she held in her mind, carefully, the image of a man who fixed radiators and kept paper flowers in his pocket and left notebooks in lost and found bins with the same deliberateness that he set mops against walls because he believed that the things you put down should be placed, not dropped. She had fired him for being in the wrong corridor. The shame of it was clean and sharp, not the diffuse guilt that fades into background noise, but the specific shame of having been wrong in a way that had consequences. She did not try to diminish it. She drove to the office with it sitting quietly in her chest. And she let it sit there, because she had come to believe, in the past several days, that the right response to this particular feeling was not to argue with it or to accelerate past it, but simply to let it make her careful. Her father had been right about that too. Ethan Marsh opened the notebook that evening, sitting at his kitchen table with a glass of water beside him and his laptop closed. He told himself he was opening it to find contact information, a phone number, a name, something he could use to return it. There was no contact information. What there was, and he read it slowly, with the growing discomfort of someone reading a letter not addressed to them and finding it addressed to everyone, was a record. Not a diary. Not a journal. A record, in the strict sense, dates, figures, observations, notations, in a shorthand he didn't fully understand but which, as he read further, resolved into clarity. Walter Gaines had been watching the company's financial architecture for years, not because he was employed to, because he had built the original architecture and recognized, in the publicly disclosed numbers, the shadows of decisions he had designed against. He had watched the discrepancy between reported infrastructure costs and actual infrastructure costs. He had watched the attribution of certain development patents to a holding company that had no disclosed connection to Harrington Capital but which, in the fine print of a 2009 regulatory filing he had clearly gone looking for, could be traced to a shell entity registered in the name of a trust, managed by, and here the handwriting grew smaller, more compressed, as if the writer was conserving space for something he'd spent a long time reaching. L. Burke. Ethan sat with the notebook for a long time. Then he picked up his phone, stared at it, and put it down. Then he picked it up again and sent a message to Carolyn Harrington's assistant, requesting an urgent meeting. He did not sleep that night. She met with Ethan Marsh the following morning in a conference room she'd reserved under a false project name. He was visibly nervous. He set the notebook on the table and slid it toward her. She looked at it. "Where did you get this?" He left it in the corridor. "In the Lost and Found." She opened it. She read. She was a disciplined reader. She could process documents quickly, extracting what mattered without losing the whole. She read the notebook in 12 minutes. When she finished, she closed it and placed her hands flat on the table and breathed once, steadily. "Thank you," she said. "This doesn't leave this room. Understood? You haven't made copies." "No." She looked at him, really looked at him, in the way she rarely looked at junior staff. He was younger than she'd registered. He had the face of someone who was still deciding what kind of person to become. "You could have taken this elsewhere," she said. "I know. Why didn't you?" He thought about it. "I don't know. It felt like it belonged here." She nodded once. She took the notebook. She stood and walked to the window, and she was quiet for long enough that he understood he was being dismissed. "Mr. Marsh," she said, when he reached the door. He stopped. "The morning in the lobby. You were there." "Yes." She didn't turn around. "I know." She called Douglas Fenn and asked him a question she had been constructing since the previous night. Was there, in addition to the codicil, any other provision in her father's estate that referenced a locked repository, a physical repository? There was a pause on the line. Then Douglas said, "There's a mention of a safety deposit box." We assumed it was personal items. "The key wasn't among the estate assets. The key was with Walter Gaines," she said. Another pause. That would explain some things. She already knew what it would explain. Her father had built a dead man's switch, a provision against the possibility that something would go wrong, and the people who benefited from it being wrong would be the same people positioned to prevent it from being corrected. He had not trusted the legal system to be faster than powerful men with lawyers. He had trusted a single person with the proof, and hidden that trust inside a document that would only surface when the company was old enough to survive the truth. He had chosen a janitor, not because Walter Gaines was invisible, because her father had understood, perhaps better than she had, that the most reliable people were often the ones who had already lost everything and had therefore nothing left to perform. She found Leonard Burke's office on a Tuesday. She did not go to his office. She went to her own and requested, through Theodore, a full audit of the patent attribution records from 2006 to 2012. Theodore didn't ask why. He began the process. What the audit revealed, and it took 4 days during which Carolyn ran her morning briefings and her afternoon calls and her evening reviews with the mechanical steadiness of someone walking a tightrope, was a pattern that was not accidental. A series of patents, each individually small, each individually unremarkable, had been reattributed during a consolidation process that had been signed off by 2 board members. One of those board members was no longer with the company. The other was Leonard Burke. The patents had been transferred to a holding structure. The holding structure paid licensing fees back to the company at below-market rates. The difference across 15 years, compounded, amounted to a figure that Theodore delivered to her in a memo with no commentary. Just the number. She read the number. She set the memo face down on her desk. She thought about her father. She thought about him in the way she rarely allowed herself to, not as the founder of a company, not as the architect of the culture she had inherited, but as a man who had spent his last years watching something he'd built being quietly hollowed out, and who had not, for reasons she could only guess at, been willing or able to stop it from inside. He had been 67 when he died. He had seemed, in the last months of his life, very tired. She had attributed the tiredness to illness. She understood now that the illness had not been the only cause. The board meeting was scheduled for a Thursday. She had prepared for it the way she prepared for every significant meeting. She had worked backward from the outcome she required, identified every obstacle to that outcome, and constructed a path around each obstacle. She had done this for 5 days. She had slept 4 hours a night and told no one. When Leonard Burke entered the boardroom at 9 o'clock on Thursday morning, he was smiling in the practiced way of a man who had spent 20 years being confident in rooms like this. He was taller than she was. He had the bearing of someone who had been told, repeatedly and over many years, that his bearing was impressive. She let the meeting proceed normally for 40 minutes. Then she said, "I'd like to discuss the patent consolidation of 2009. The room changed temperature. It was subtle. A slight stiffening in posture. A slowing of pen movements, but she felt it. Leonard's smile didn't falter. That was a routine operational matter. I'm not sure it warrants board time. The audit disagrees." She placed Theodore's memo on the table and slid it to the center. No one reached for it immediately. Leonard looked at it without moving. "I've asked the audit committee to review the full attribution records from 2006 through 2012, she said. "The findings are preliminary, but they suggest a discrepancy between recorded and actual licensing revenues over a 15-year period." She paused. "A significant discrepancy." Leonard's voice was very controlled. "Audits find discrepancies. That's what audits are for. This should go through proper channels." "You're right," she said. "It will." She looked around the table. The other directors were watching with the careful attention of people who had not yet decided which way to fall. "I'm informing the board because it's my obligation to do so. I'm also informing the board that the documentation supporting these findings goes beyond the audit records," Leonard said. "What documentation?" She had been waiting for that question. She had known it would come in that phrasing, or close to it. What documentation? Not "what are you referring to?" Not "I'm not sure what you mean." The specificity of the question revealed the specificity of his knowledge. "I'll share it when the investigation is complete," she said. She adjourned the meeting 20 minutes later. Leonard left without speaking to her. She watched him go and noted the precise quality of the silence he carried with him. She was in her office at 5 that afternoon when her assistant knocked. "There's someone in the lobby," her assistant said. "He says you're not expecting him. But he said to give you this." She held out a small folded note. One line, in small angular handwriting. "The safety deposit box is at Meridian Trust on 5th. I have the key." She stood immediately. She had taken 3 steps toward the door when she stopped. She went back to her desk. She opened her bottom drawer and took out the letter that Douglas Fenn had left with her, the full codicil, with its legal language about custodian of record and its carefully dated signature. She folded it and put it in her jacket pocket. She wasn't sure why. She understood only that if this meeting was what she thought it was, she did not want to be in it empty-handed. Not because she needed proof of anything, because she wanted him to know that she had read it, that she had understood what her father had constructed and why. That she was not arriving as a CEO collecting an asset, but as a person arriving, late, to a conversation she should have been part of years ago. She took the elevator down. In the lobby, She paused before she reached him. She had spent a great deal of the past week studying him. Not him, exactly, since she couldn't observe him. She had been studying the record of him, the building's camera archive from the past 4 years, the Meridian Services logs, the notebook, the conversations she'd had with Ruth Ann at the diner, with the building manager Frank, with the girl on the stoop with paint on her wrist. Each source had described the same person in different registers, a man who moved through the world without demanding to be recognized, who fixed what was broken and kept what was given to him, and declined to perform either virtue or grievance. She had been trying to understand what kind of person did that for 15 years. She thought she understood, now, the kind of person who had already proven something to themselves and no longer needed to prove it to anyone else. The kind of person who had been stripped of attribution and position and had discovered, in the aftermath, that what remained after you removed the professional identity and the institutional affiliation and the salary and the business cards was still a person, still capable, still, in the original sense of the word, valuable. It was not a realization she had ever been forced to make. She had been Carolyn Harrington of Harrington Capital since she was old enough to understand what the name meant. She had never had to find out who she was without it. Walter Gaines had found out. He had taken a cleaning job and come back to the building her father had built, not to petition or to haunt, but to watch, to see if the thing they had built together had a future worth protecting. She found this, for reasons she did not entirely understand, very moving. She crossed the lobby. He was in the lobby, standing near the east corridor, at roughly the same spot where she had first spoken to him. He was not wearing the pale blue uniform. He wore a gray sweater, dark trousers, ordinary shoes. He looked the same. The broad face, the gray eyes, the settled calm, except now the calm was visible as what it had always been, not absence of feeling, but the discipline of a person who has decided not to let feeling make his decisions. He looked at her without expression. "Mr. Gaines," she said. "Miss Harrington." They stood in the lobby of the building her father had built, the marble floor beneath them reflecting the overhead lights in long, cold streaks. And she understood that this moment had been coming for a long time, that it had been set in motion before she was old enough to understand what corporations were, by her father and by this man, and by a decision her father had made about who to trust when trust was the only remaining tool. "I owe you an apology," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You don't need to apologize for what you didn't know. I need to apologize for what I chose not to know." He looked at her steadily. There was no theatrics in his expression, no satisfaction at being acknowledged, no wound on display. He simply received the words and held them. "All right," he said. They went together to Meridian Trust on Fifth Avenue. The key opened a box that had been paid for annually for 17 years. Each payment drafted from an account she later learned had been established by her father solely for this purpose. Inside the box was a hard drive, sealed in a static-free bag, and a letter in her father's handwriting. She did not read the letter until she was alone. The hard drive went into her bag. Walter walked beside her to the door of the bank, and they stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the early evening light, the city moving past them in its continuous way. "You could have come to me sooner," she said. "After I fired you, you had the notebook. You had the key." "I could have," he said. "Why didn't you?" He was quiet for a moment, not because he didn't have an answer, but because he was choosing the precise one. "Because you would have received it as a threat," he said. "A fired employee showing up with documents. Even if the documents were solid, it would have looked like leverage, and it would have been defended against as leverage. And then we'd have spent 2 years in litigation instead of 6 weeks in an audit." He looked at the street. "I waited until you'd done enough of your own work to understand what you were looking at." She thought about the week of investigation that had preceded his return, the audit she'd commissioned, the conversations with Theodore, the camera archive, and the regulatory filings, and the codicil and the notebook that Ethan Marsh had brought her. She had done, in the space of 8 days, what might have taken a legal team 6 months if she hadn't already understood the architecture of the problem. "You calculated that I'd investigate. Your father told me you would," he said. "If the conditions were right." She looked at him. "What conditions?" if the thing you were investigating was a betrayal of something you cared about. He said it without weight, as a simple observation. You wouldn't investigate an abstract injustice. Too many of those. But an injustice that was also a lie told to you, personally, by someone who claimed to be loyal that you'd pursue to the end. She was silent for a moment. She thought about whether to be bothered by being understood, that precisely by a man she'd fired for mopping the wrong corridor. She decided not to be. It was too accurate to be bothered by. He knew me well, she said. He loved you, Walter said. He wasn't always sure how to say it in a language you'd hear. The evening was cool. The streetlights had come on, amber in the dusk. Walk back with me, she said. It was not a command. It was closer to a question. He walked back with her, but when they reached the building, he said good night at the door, and she went in alone. And when she arrived on the 14th floor, she sat at her desk for a while in the quiet building, the city lights spreading in every direction beyond the glass, and she read her father's letter. Then she called Theodore. He arrived within 40 minutes, which said something about him, a man who, when reached at 8 in the evening with the words "I have the drive," did not ask questions that could wait until morning. They worked until midnight. He plugged the drive into the isolated terminal they'd prepared, and the files opened in sequence. 17 years of original system architecture, original patent filings with their unredacted attribution fields, original board minutes that the official record had been made to contradict. And at the end of a folder labeled simply 2009, a recording audio only. 63 minutes long of a meeting in which 3 voices, one of them, Leonard Burke's, crisp and very assured, discussed the consolidation in terms that left no room for interpretation. They played it once through without speaking. When it ended, Theodore held the drive for a moment with the care of someone holding something irreplaceable. He was thorough, Theodore said. He had 17 years, she said. Leonard Burke resigned from the board 6 weeks later. The resignation was announced as voluntary. It was not. The regulatory filing that followed naming the holding structure and the below-market licensing arrangement was 300 pages long and written in the measured language of financial law, which is a language designed to make extraordinary things sound procedural. Carolyn read all 300 pages. She signed the cover letter. She did not issue a press statement. When asked by the company's communications team what tone the announcement should take, she said, "Factual." They asked if she wanted to include remarks about the company's commitment to integrity. She said the filing itself was the statement. Theodore, who had watched this exchange from the doorway of the communications office, thought she was right. He told her so, briefly, afterward, in the elevator. She said nothing in response, but she looked at him directly, which she had always done, and nodded once, which she did not always do, and he understood the distinction. In the weeks that followed, the company experienced the specific turbulence of an institution, undergoing a reckoning that the institution itself had triggered. The stock moved in both directions before stabilizing. 2 journalists filed requests for comment. The communications team drafted responses that Carolyn reviewed and almost always shortened. A law firm representing Leonard Burke's estate sent a letter that Theodore handled without bringing to her because it required no decision from her, and he understood the boundary between what did and did not require her attention. The board was reconstituted. 3 new directors were brought in. Carolyn chaired their orientation herself, which was not standard procedure, and which she did anyway, because she had decided that the values of an institution are transmitted most clearly when the person accountable for them treats that transmission as their own work rather than delegating it. It was slower than she wanted. It was more careful than she was accustomed to being. She was learning to tell the difference between speed and effectiveness, which was not a lesson she had ever expected to need at 41. She called Walter Gaines on a Tuesday evening. "The board has asked if you'd consider an advisory role," she said. "Formalizing your knowledge of the early architecture. Helping with the attribution corrections." "No," he said. She had expected this. "Is there anything you would accept?" A pause. "There are 14 people on the overnight cleaning crew in this building," he said. 2 of them have been on short-term contracts for 3 years each. Short-term contracts don't qualify for health benefits. She was quiet for a moment. I'll look into it. There's also a man named Marcus, who works the loading dock. He's been requesting a transfer to the mailroom for 2 years. No one's processed it. I'll look into that too. Another pause, shorter this time. That's all, he said. She said, Mr. Gaines. The notebook. I read it. I know. You watched this for years. You could have come forward sooner. I came forward when I had enough, he said. Coming forward with half a story doesn't protect anyone. It just makes you a target. She thought about that for a while after the call ended. The letter from her father was 4 pages long. It was dated 3 months before his death. He had written it, she understood from certain internal references, after a doctor's appointment at which certain things had been confirmed, and he had written it with the clear handwriting of a person who was not in crisis, but who had decided, with the remaining time available to him, to be precise. He wrote about Walter. He wrote about the years before the company was profitable, when the two of them had worked in a borrowed office space and debated, over bad coffee and worse sandwiches, what kind of company they were trying to build. He wrote that Walter had been right about almost everything in those years, and that he had been wrong about enough that the combination had been generative rather than comfortable. He wrote that the consolidation, the removal of Walter's name, the restructuring of the early records had happened while he was ill the first time, a hospitalization that had lasted 4 months, during which certain decisions had been made without his knowledge. He wrote that when he returned, he had been told, by Leonard, that the restructuring was complete and legal, and had been reviewed. He wrote that he had believed this, because he had been tired and because he had trusted Leonard, who had been his friend for 20 years, and that this was the mistake he was least able to forgive himself for. He wrote that he had found the truth eventually. He wrote that he had found Walter, who had taken the cleaning job you're building, her father wrote, because he said he wanted to see if the thing we'd built had survived its builders, and that they had spoken in the parking garage, twice, in the evenings, without anyone watching. He wrote that Walter had never asked him to do anything, had not asked for credit, or money, or a position, had simply confirmed the figures, and said, I have a record, if it's needed. I built the dead man's switch, her father wrote, because I knew that powerful men move faster than investigations, and because I wanted you to have enough before they could move. I chose Walter because he is the only person I have ever known who kept faith without needing anyone to know he was doing it. That is a rare quality. I hope you recognize it. The last paragraph was short. I know you will handle this correctly. I know this because I watched you become harder than I would have wanted. And I also watched you become more careful than I ever was. And I believe these are not unrelated. Be careful, Carolyn. Be careful with the people who don't announce themselves. She sat with the letter for a long time. Then she folded it and put it in the drawer of her desk, in the back, where she kept the things that mattered. 3 months later, on a Tuesday morning in October, Carolyn Harrington arrived at the office at 6:43. The lobby was quiet. The marble reflected the lights. The security guard straightened when she entered, and she nodded to him a small acknowledgement, the kind she had been practicing, which felt effortful at first, and now felt closer to right. He was a man named Gary, who had worked the morning desk for 11 years. She had not known his name 11 weeks ago. She knew it now. She was walking toward the elevator when she heard it, the quiet sound of a mop on marble, coming from the east corridor. She stopped. The man working was young, 20. Perhaps 22, with the unhurried movements of someone who was paying attention to the floor and not to who might be watching. He was working carefully, the way you work when you take the job seriously regardless of who's watching or not watching. He hadn't noticed her. She stood still for a moment and watched him work. He was methodical. He covered the same stretch twice, then moved on. He was not performing thoroughness. He was simply being thorough, in the uncelebrated way of someone who had decided what the job required and was delivering it without needing anyone to witness the delivery. She recognized something in this. It was a quality she had always associated with strength, with competence, with the particular brand of capability she valued above sentiment. She had always assumed it was cold. She understood now that it was not cold at all. It was, in fact, the opposite of cold. It was the warmth of a person who respected the work enough to do it fully, and who respected themselves enough not to need to be seen doing it. She crossed the lobby to the east corridor. He looked up. His face was guarded in the automatic way of a young person who has learned that authority addressing them is rarely good news. "This corridor," she said. "The stone near the elevator base. It holds water when there's a spill. You have to go slowly, or you'll push the moisture deeper instead of lifting it." He looked at her, then at the floor, then back at her. "Okay," he said carefully. "I'll have facilities mark it," she said. "So you know where the problem areas are." She moved to go. Then she turned back, because there was one more thing, and she had been deciding for 3 months whether it was too small a thing to say or too large, and she had finally concluded that the question itself was the wrong one. The question implied that the value of a thing could be measured by its size. She no longer believed this. "Thank you," she said, "for coming in this early." He blinked. Yeah, of course." She walked to the elevator. Gary looked up from the security desk as she passed. She nodded once. He nodded back. The lobby was very quiet. The marble was very clean. Outside, through the glass on 3 sides, the city was beginning its morning. The buses, the coffee vendors, the people moving fast and the people moving slow, all of it unremarkable and continuous and alive. She pressed the button for the 14th floor. The doors opened. She stepped in, and the doors closed behind her. And she was already thinking about the 8 o'clock briefing. The agenda she'd revised the night before, the questions she'd want answered before noon. She was thinking about Marcus on the loading dock, and whether the transfer had been processed yet, and about the 2 cleaning staff on short-term contracts, and the timeline Patricia Aldridge had given her for converting them to full-time. She was thinking about Ethan Marsh, who had brought her a notebook when he could have taken it elsewhere, and about whether his next performance review reflected what that had cost him and what it said about his character. She was thinking, in the small and practical and continuous way that real change actually happens, about the people who didn't announce themselves. The elevator rose.